So starting with forest B02, what I'm going to do is just bring the sunlight back to the ray trace mode at the moment, so turning off the shadow map. And another thing I want to do to the ecosystem, so going into the advanced material editor and the ecosystem layer, I'm going to go over to the scaling and orientation tab. And what we have is a maximum size variation located underneath the overall scaling. This allows you to create a overall scale if the key proportions is set to uniform at 100%. So the maximum size variation of 1 is going to scale the vegetation, or in this case the vegetation, but anything in it within the ecosystem population up or down by a value of 1. Well, I'm going to bring this down to 0.2. Because I want these all to be relatively the same size, the larger trees to begin with. And if we need to modify the overall scale to make them a little bit larger, we can do that. But I think that should be good for now. One thing I'm noticing is that the shadows that should be casting in front of the path are not showing because of the dynamic population. Typically, we would have a good amount of vegetation, at least in previous versions. I would notice that that wasn't really an issue, and it should be taking that into account because that is obviously a big part of the influence, is having items behind the camera to cast shadows in that forest. So I will ultimately be moving the camera somewhere else, but if we wanted to have those shadows showing up, I'm going to turn off the dynamic population and do a normal population, and then we see that big shadow, if you take a look at the preview, showing in front of the camera down on the path. So if needed, what I can do is go to the select ecosystem instances up at the top next to the painter, and if you are working in the integrated version within the host application, you will need to switch to the standalone version in order to use this tool. And it's really useful. What it allows you to do is select instances, and what I'm going to do is change the size of the brush, and just in the top view select the instances behind the camera. And then under Manipulate, we have this little box we can open up, a little arrow. And what we're going to do is move the instances to the global ecosystem, so the painted ecosystem. And if we need to deselect some of those, we can. It looks like maybe the scaling might be a little different. Go to Display Options, turn off Allow Full Quality in your camera. So opening the painter to edit the global ecosystem. Making sure they're all set to shaded billboard. Looks like at the moment those just are not showing up. I'm going to go back to the selector and select None, or click on Select None. And then back in the terrain, edit the material and switch it back to dynamic population, preview it. And it just looks like those instances are not showing up in the viewport. I just want to check and see what's happening to those, whether or not they're really large or what happened to the scale. So what I'm going to do is create a duplicate of the camera by using this little store camera. It's a little, looks like a little saved 3.5-inch floppy disk. And clicking on that will create a duplicate. And if we go up to the top where it says main camera within this navigator here, we can right click and switch to camera 1, which is now our duplicate. And I'm going to just rotate the camera around and see whether or not those are even going to show up. So just clicking on the preview, and it looks like the transfer made them too large. I believe that's a little bit of a bug, actually a large bug. What is happening is we're inside of the trunk of one of the trees. So I'm going to switch over to the painted ecosystem and just see if I can get this to update. Select single instance, select one of the trees, and just click on it. Close this out. And it hasn't given us the global ecosystem object either. So for the moment, I'm going to clear that, and it looks like we're not going to be able to use that for now. That's just because, like I said, I am using the pre-release. Hopefully that is fixed soon. I will go ahead and report it, and we can try to get that fixed before the final release. So if I need to have any of those additional plants behind, what I probably will end up doing is converting them to objects instead of moving them to the global ecosystem. I'm going to worry about that later because they're just going to hog up resources at the moment. I can also just switch to standard population. This is a smaller scene, so that may be worth considering. But for now, let's move on. And I want to show you some of the layering techniques. So what we're going to do is add in another ecosystem layer. I'm going to go down to that dirt path. Also, we're going to rename the ecosystem layer. It will duplicate whatever layer is selected when you select ecosystem. So I'm going to rename this the large trees, or just large trees, and then go back to dirt path, select ecosystem, and we're going to call these small trees. And then I'm going to raise up the layer above the large tree, and we're going to add in some additional plants. So now I'm going to add in those smaller plants that I created, and they should load pretty quickly because they were already added in to the scene. So the ones that haven't been added in yet will need to prepare and create the variations. And looks like I'm going to report this one too. So I'm going to have to open this back up and start over again. Okay, I've moved the large trees over to static population and have it populated. And the small trees, I now have the 3 in the list that I want to use. I'm going to turn off the full quality in your camera, or allowing it, even though none of them are selected to have that on, just turning them off for the moment. I'm going to go ahead and just do a quick population just to take a look at the scale and see how that's showing. Some of them may need to be scaled down a little bit or up a little bit. But I think for the most part, I'm going to keep them about where they're at. Now, the features I want to show you involve taking the population from the layer below it into account when creating its distribution. These are located under distribution, where we have affinity with layer and then the repulsion from layer. Now, affinity with layer, what we can do is increase that amount, and what it'll do is make the trees populate around the existing trees. So what this is essentially doing is grouping them to go around the bases of the current trees. Now, we do have some items showing up on the path. So what we also need to do is take the alpha, and I'm going to try to do that copy and paste this time. Control C to copy this texture. Go up to the next material layer, edit the alpha, and see if we can paste that in. It did work this time. Connect that to the grayscale output, and that way we shouldn't have anything showing up on the path still. But it will start to group the items around the other trees. What I'm also going to do is go over to the sunlight, turn off the shadow map, which I I believe I did earlier, but since I had crashed the program and didn't get a chance to save, that was gone. So the more the affinity is up, the closer the grouping is going to be. I'm just going to do a quick render here, something a little bit smaller. And the quality of the shadows just doesn't look very good right now. Once again, going back to the fact that none of the leaf textures are being smoothed out. You would need to use texture filtering for that, which is going to really increase render time and also smooth out every single texture, and in some cases it will produce a result that is completely undesired on some of the different plans because it is relative to scale, and some of the scales of different barks are really extreme, and they'll smooth out too much. So just for now, I'm going to leave it kind of crappy looking just for the moment. We'll be adjusting the lighting in a little bit. Also, that dirt path needs to be adjusted because it does not look very good. So we're going to go to the material editor and adjust that dirt path. What we're going to do is right-click on the color production, edit function. Now, if we take a look at the color, it's really kind of bland. There's not much to it. So it's not really going to show all that much because we are creating a forest which is mostly going to be ambient light. And in an ambient light situation, things like bump don't really show up, even if we were connecting anything to the diffuse or ambient outputs. Wouldn't give us the kind of effect or look that we can get from modifying the color. So what I want to do is add in a new fractal. We're going to click over here where we've got just that red box, add in a fractal, switch over to the grainy fractal. And what I'm going to do is add in color map, and I'm going to load in from texture editor, or from rocks and grass, the black and white color map. You could also just edit it or reset the color map by right-clicking, select reset, and then add in those key points where we've got white and black. And I'm going to use that in connection to the grainy fractal. And then two things, two more nodes add in. I'm going to add in the combiner node, set it to color combiner, and we're going to mix the current color with this new color map, setting it to multiply. And then I'm going to add another combiner, setting it to blender, and blend together that color, the existing color, with the new color combiner. And now we could set that to a blend, or we could subtract it. We could multiply it in order to darken it. So let's go ahead and set that to 0.65 of a multiply. And then going back to the grainy fractal, we can modify it further in order to really change the output. Now if we select this blender, and if we want to see how this area of the function just before the final output is being affected, we can select to show that in the lower right or lower left corner here where it says show and graph. We can turn that on. Also go ahead and zoom in so you can see it a little bit better. And now what we can do is adjust things like the smooth area altitude in order to increase the darkness, adjust the gain, we could also adjust the scale. I could turn off metascale, increase distortion, now we'll go ahead and maybe multiply that a little bit more. Keeping in mind this is really only showing in that dirt path, so the overall surface isn't going to change as much in the function output observer, but we can see all of this color variation now within the node preview. So that path should really darken up now, and I'm going to go ahead and save out the scene. Now if we go back to the ecosystem layer, the small trees, right now we have Affinity with layer set to 100%. Now if we wanted to do reverse, we could set up the repulsion from layer and populate. If it's set too high, it is going to create no population. So we may also need to decrease the affinity with layer. And increase repulsion. And sometimes we will also need to increase the density and the sampling boost in order to get that to show up properly. And what this will allow us to do is fill in the areas outside of the trees. And it looks like just really this isn't showing up very well. Or even at all in the preview. But typically that's what that will allow you to do. Might be a problem with the alpha. So what I want to do is go back and set that affinity to 70%, populate. The density is up way too high now, so bring that down to, say, 35%. I also want to just go ahead and take a look at how it is turning out. I am going to increase the scale. The size variation I'm going to keep at 1 because I want more size variation with these plants. And then we can set an overall scale. Since I'm going to scale everything and not anything specifically, we can set up an overall scaling. Let's go ahead and set it to 1.6. Maybe 1.3. And then I'm going to adjust the presence of my rural maple tree variation to 2, so there's more of those. And it's starting to look a little bit better. And might want to fill that in with a higher density. Now, before I go ahead and darken some of the bark textures or bark materials, which are currently way too bright in comparison to leaves, we need to take a look at the gamma and the lighting and how we're going to have that set up. Because right now I have the gamma set for the texture maps pretty high, so it's really going to darken any textures. And since most of the bark is linked to a material or procedural, they're not going to show up as dark. So what I want to do is balance out the gamma in relation to the procedurals. And we're going to open I'm going to just close out that render. I'm going to double click on the main camera. My current display gamma is set to 1.4. Now for a forest type scene, since we're not really seeing the sky or any really large landscapes, I am going to modify the gamma to 1. Our input gamma for texture maps, the higher we raise this gamma, the darker the textures are going to get. So right now I have my input set to 2. If I set it to 1, it should create a brighter texture, which will balance out the procedural to the rest of the scene. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And I might need to boost up that texture a little bit higher. We'll go ahead and see how this currently looks. So actually we've lost, I think, a lot of detail in the leaves, a lot of the color, that really nice contrast there was, and really just kind of darkened the terrain rather than the trunks of the trees. So I think in this case what I want to do is maybe keep the gamma. Go ahead and double click on the main camera. I'm going to set the display gamma to 1.2, texture maps back 2.2. Also keeping in mind that the output gamma is going to modify the images that you're saving. So the input gamma is anything you have in materials or backgrounds, anything loaded into functions controlling part of the scene, and then the output is the gamma that is set when you're saving an image. Typically, I would set this to match your display gamma in order to get a good match between what you're seeing when you're rendering in the screen and your final output saves. Unless you're working in 32-bit, then you may not need to make those adjustments, although sometimes they can be helpful. It really can take some more playing around with depending on the scene. So if we take a look at the bark materials, so going over to the second tab in the world browser, we have a material tab. This is going to show us ecosystems, and the ecosystem materials is what we're looking at, and we can see all of the materials making up the ecosystem. So we can go through the individual bark and the trunks. Just we don't need to adjust the leaves, but going through the barks and the roots and the branches and decreasing their color intensity. So let's start with the gray trunk, and I'm going to go to Effects, and I'm going to take and cut the diffuse and ambient in half, or around half. Actually, we'll go ahead and do 30 and 20, so we will cut it in half. Click OK, and then what it needs to do is update the ecosystem, and I'm just going to go through and do this with all of the different bark materials and darken them, because I think they're too bright. I'm going to be using some different lighting, and I want a good contrast between everything. So I'm going to continue with this, and then we'll be able to pick up from there and take a look at another ecosystem layer and then lighting. So now if we take a look, the bark is definitely darker. I think I will bring back the display gamma to a value of 1.6, so 1.6, and it still needs a little bit of work because of the way the shadows are set up, but we're also going to be making some modifications to the lighting, which will make a huge impact and change on the rest of the scene. So what I'm going to do to start with is go to the atmosphere editor, atmosphere editor, and I am going to go to the sun and lift it up just a little bit, and also and move it around. So it looks like we've got just a little bit of light coming through, but still mostly it's shadows. So 150. Let's go ahead and set the pitch to 40. Now we're going to click on the Light tab, and we can adjust balances between ambient and sunlight. The light balance, when we are in the lighting model of global ambience, for the best looking renders, global ambience and some of the lower settings are going to give you the best options. The standard lighting model isn't always as good. Usually it will just kind of wash out the scene. It requires a lot of fine-tuning. But in the global ambience mode, we've got a lot more control over shadows and lighting, and the influence of the color of the scene itself from the sky. So now, basically, the main thing we want to look at is the light balance, which is adjusting primarily the intensity of shadows. So if we increase this to, let's say, 80% towards the sunlight, our shadows will darken, and then the points that are in part of the diffuse area are going to be much brighter. And then going in a reverse direction, it's going to balance everything out a little bit darker. So I'm going to keep it at 50 right now. And first, there's another thing I want to adjust, which is in the Sky Fog and Haze tab, the glow intensity, and also the scattering of the light, which is basically going to broaden the light around the scene and adjust the balance of the brightest areas to the darker areas. So I'm going to set the glow intensity to 30, and the scattering, we'll leave it right there for now, and just see how the glow intensity affects this. We should see a lot more of the ambient light color in a nicer balance. And the trees themselves are starting to look a little bit better. The terrain is now almost entirely within ambient light, which these materials don't look great when they're just ambient lit. The path has almost disappeared completely, and I might need to make a few changes to decrease the ambience, or the intensity of that. Or we can make some additional adjustments to the scattering. The more we raise this number, the darker the scene will get, and the less spread out light will be. And then if we bring it down, let's say 0.6, it's really going to lighten everything. Without spending too much time adjusting the lighting, and since it looks like, for the most part, the diffusion, or the way the shadows are set up, really isn't going to show very much with the ray trace mode. We will get much more variation in lighting from using a shadow map. So I'm going to go back, check, and turn back on that shadow map. We should be able to get a much better looking light output. So it is definitely balanced a little bit better now. If we want to get the best lighting we can, we're going to need to switch over to a minimum of ambient occlusion. And what ambient occlusion does is it creates shadows based on objects not exposed, or areas of the scene that are not exposed to the sky lighting. So anytime you're around another object or underneath an object, in this case underneath the trees, the shadows would be darker, getting darker around bases of the trees. We can turn on the ambient occlusion, and now what's going to happen is we're going to render first a pre-pass, which is going to calculate the ambient light, and then after the first pass is done, it's going to pass together and or combine the pre-pass with the final output. So I'm going to let that finish up and be able to see what it looks like with the ambient occlusion turned on. So the difference now is really quite huge. Overall, it looks just much better. There's a lot more balance and differences in light. As we start to get down to this lower section here, where there's really not a lot of exposure to the light, there's a lot denser vegetation, it starts to get nice and dark, as it normally would. With the gamma brought down to 1.4, we can see even more of a dramatic effect. We can go back and update that, bring it all the way down to 1, and see a very dark look, where we're going to see the full effect of the occlusion. And then we can modify, we can turn off the natural film response and go and adjust exposure. I'm just going to click OK. And I'm going to move down this render view just a little bit so that render time output is not affecting this. But you can see a huge difference, and when you start to get really overexposed, then the natural film response becomes very helpful. But it will remove some of the darkest areas in some cases, really depending on the diffusion and different lighting setups you have. but it's definitely starting to look better. The changes you can't make to gamma that will show instantly are the texture map. I could change that to a value of 1, click OK. It's not going to modify anything because that is based within the render, because it does modify all the different lighting settings. So if I do need to decrease that to get rid of some of the intensity on the leaves, I can reduce that down from 2. I believe the default is 1.8, but I've changed mine so many times since then. I've been sticking with 2.2 because I use a lot of my own custom materials, but in this case I'm using mostly presets just so it's something that you have available. Now, I'm really starting to hate this tree in front here, and I just want to get rid of it. So what I'm going to do is delete it the easiest way possible. Go into the terrain, and this is part of the large trees. It should be part of the large trees. We can go to Paint, and make sure that Paint What is set to a bit of everything. Set it to the eraser, and there's that little dot right down here, and that should be the tree. You click on it, and the tree is gone. Close that out, click OK. And since we were working with a static population and not dynamic population, we do have the ability to just modify that. Makes it a little bit easier. So if we wanted to see more of a darkening along this side, we would need to modify where the sunlight is coming in from. Might be desired, but for now what I want to do is move on and show just setting up one more layer. We're going to take care of some ground vegetation and kind of cover the landscape with some lower level vegetation that we can, in this case, use the dynamic population because we're not going to really need to worry about the influence of shadows. And because we're going to have such small vegetation, it's going to take up a lot of resources to save.